The stairs creaked under our weight as we made our way down, and with every step, the air got colder. My breath fogged up in front of me, which made no sense because it was the middle of summer. It didn't help that the only light came from our flashlights, which flickered slightly every now and then, casting long, jittery shadows on the walls. The basement was huge, bigger than I expected. It stretched out in front of us, half in shadow, with dusty old furniture, crates, and random junk scattered around like someone had just left everything behind in a hurry. The walls were made of stone, damp and covered in a layer of grime that made the place feel even more like something out of a nightmare. "Dude, this place is disgusting," Mark muttered, kicking an old, rusted metal can out of his way. It clattered across the floor, the noise echoing through the space in an unsettling way. "I'm telling you, man, this is where they filmed the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre." I joked, though my voice sounded more nervous than I intended. Kyle, always the one to keep up appearances, laughed, but it was forced. I could tell he was just as uncomfortable as the rest of us. "Come on, guys, it's just a basement," he said, shining his flashlight around, though he didn't sound so sure of himself. "Nothing to be freaked out about. Probably just full of old junk." "Yeah, or dead bodies," Jess said under her breath. "Thanks for that, Jess," I muttered, shaking my head as I scanned the room with my light. As we moved further into the basement, that weird smell hit us even harder. It wasn't just the musty, damp scent of an old house anymore. It was rotten, foul, like something had died down here and never been found. "Okay, what is that?" Sarah said, covering her nose with her sleeve. "It smells like something crawled down here to die." "Maybe it's an animal," Kyle said, though he didn't sound too convinced. I could see the unease spreading across all our faces, even though no one wanted to say anything. The scratching noise we had heard upstairs was back too. Faint at first, like it was coming from the walls, but growing louder the deeper we went. Mark suddenly stopped and shined his light at the far end of the room. His face went pale. "Wait, do you guys see that?" he whispered, pointing. I followed the beam of his flashlight and saw what he was talking about. In the corner, there was something that looked like a large piece of furniture covered in a dirty, torn sheet. But it was what was behind it that got my attention. There was another door, a smaller, rusted metal door we hadn't seen before, tucked away behind the junk. Kyle squinted at it, stepping forward a little. I didn't even know that was there." "How could you not know?" Sarah asked, her voice tight with anxiety. "You live here?" "I mean, I haven't spent a lot of time down here." "I told you it's creepy as hell," Kyle said defensively, though I could tell he was rattled too. Jess stepped forward, flashing her light directly at the door. "So, who wants to open it?" "No one," I said quickly, my stomach twisting into knots. Absolutely no one. But Kyle, being Kyle, felt like he had to prove something. He wasn't going to let us leave without at least checking it out. Without saying a word, he walked over to the sheet-covered object and pulled it away with a quick yank. Dust flew up, making us cough and wave our hands in front of our faces. Underneath the sheet was an old, broken-down wardrobe. It looked ancient, like something you'd find in your grandma's attic, covered in cobwebs and missing pieces. But none of us were focused on the wardrobe. All eyes were on the rusted door behind it. The door had no handle, just a simple latch that looked like it hadn't been opened in years, maybe decades. It was covered in rust, and the walls around it were stained dark, like water had leaked through at some point. But it wasn't water. At least it didn't look like water. "I don't think we should open that," Jess said, her voice shaky. Kyle hesitated, his hand hovering over the latch. "It's probably just another storage room," he said, though he didn't sound so sure. "I'm with Jess," I said. "Let's just head back upstairs. We've seen enough." But it was too late. Kyle had already unlatched the door. It creaked open with the same eerie sound as the basement door had, but this time it was worse. It felt wrong, like we had just opened something we were never meant to touch. Behind the door was a narrow hallway. Dark, damp, and even colder than the basement. The floor was made of dirt, and the walls were unfinished stone, rough and jagged. The smell hit us hard, stronger than before. The air felt heavy, oppressive, like it was pushing down on us, making it hard to breathe. "No way," Mark said, stepping back. "I'm not going in there." But Kyle was already shining his flashlight down the hallway, taking a few cautious steps inside. He paused and looked back at us, a nervous grin on his face. "Come on, guys. Just a quick look." Reluctantly, and maybe out of some stupid sense of loyalty, we followed him. The hallway was narrow, and I had to walk single file behind Kyle. The walls felt like they were closing in the further we went. I could hear the others breathing behind me. Quick, shallow breaths that matched my own. The scratching sound was louder now, almost like it was coming from directly beneath our feet. "What's that noise?" Sarah whispered from behind me. "Is it the pipes?" "I don't know," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. But it didn't sound like pipes. It sounded alive. We kept moving forward deeper into the hallway. It seemed to stretch on forever, even though it couldn't have been more than 20 or 30 feet. The cold was biting now, seeping into my skin, and the smell. I was doing everything I could not to gag. Then, out of nowhere, Kyle stopped. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Hear what?" I asked, my heart pounding so hard it was like I could feel it in my throat. Kyle turned to face us, his flashlight shaking in his hand. "I swear I heard something. Like footsteps." We all froze. No one moved. No one even breathed. And then we all heard it. Footsteps. Slow. Steady. Coming from behind us, back towards the basement. None of us dared to turn around. "Guys," Jess whispered, her voice cracking. "What the hell is that?" No one answered, because none of us had a clue what was waiting for us back there. I could feel my pulse in my ears. We all stood frozen in that dark, narrow hallway, none of us wanting to admit we had heard the footsteps behind us. For a second, I thought maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe the fear was messing with my head. But when I glanced at the others, I knew they'd heard it too. Mark's face had gone pale, and Jess's hands were shaking so badly that the beam from her flashlight jittered across the walls. Even Kyle, who usually played it cool, looked genuinely freaked out. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, there was dead silence. No one moved. No one breathed. It was like the air had been sucked out of the hallway, leaving only the pounding of our hearts. "Let's get the hell out of here," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. I could hear the panic creeping in, and honestly, I felt the same. We needed to leave now. I turned around, ready to bolt back through the basement when I saw it. The door at the far end of the basement, the one we had come through, was closed. I knew for a fact we had left it open. There was no way any of us had shut it. My stomach dropped. "Wait," I said, grabbing Kyle's arm to stop him from moving. "The door, it's closed." He turned to look, his eyes widening as he saw what I was talking about. "What the hell?" he muttered under his breath, taking a few steps toward it. "Did you close it?" Mark asked, his voice shaky. "No, none of us did," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I swear, it was open when we came in." Jess let out a small, panicked laugh, but there was no humor in it. "Great, just great. We're locked in a creepy basement with something walking around behind us. Perfect." Kyle, trying to hold on to some shred of control, shook his head. "Relax. It's probably just the wind or something. These old houses do weird stuff." But even as he said it, I could tell he didn't believe his own words. "I don't care if it's the wind, a ghost, or the damn tooth fairy," Mark said, his voice rising. "Let's just get out of here." Kyle moved towards the door, and we all followed, sticking close together like we were trying to draw some kind of strength from each other. I felt a chill run down my spine, and it wasn't just the cold air in the basement. Something was wrong, seriously wrong. The atmosphere felt thick, almost suffocating, like the darkness was pressing in on us, making it harder to breathe. When we reached the basement door, Kyle grabbed the handle and twisted. It didn't budge. "Come on, man, don't mess around," I said, my voice more tense than I wanted it to be. "I'm not messing around," Kyle snapped, frustration breaking through his calm facade. He yanked harder on the door, but it still wouldn't move. "It's stuck. Stuck," Jess said, panic edging her voice. "How can it be stuck? We just came through it." Kyle pulled again, this time with both hands, but the door stayed firmly in place. He let out a curse under his breath. "It's not just stuck. It's like it's locked from the outside." "That's not possible," I said, stepping forward to help him. I grabbed the handle and pulled as hard as I could, but he was right. It was like the door had been sealed shut from the other side. My heart started pounding even harder, my mind racing with possibilities, none of them good. "Okay, so what do we do now?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "We need to calm down," Kyle said, stepping back from the door and running his hand through his hair. "We'll figure something out." "Figure something out?" Jess practically shrieked. "We're trapped down here with whatever the hell is making those footsteps. We need to get out, Kyle." "We will," he said, but there was no confidence in his voice anymore. "There's got to be another way out." I didn't want to freak out, but I couldn't shake the growing sense of dread creeping up my spine. The footsteps had stopped, but the silence was even worse. It felt like something was watching us, waiting for the right moment to strike. As we stood there, trying to figure out what to do, I noticed something. In the dim light of the flashlights, I could see a faint outline on the wall next to the door. It looked like a seam, or maybe a crack, running vertically along the stone. "Hey, what's this?" I said, stepping closer to the wall. I reached out and touched the seam. The stone felt cold, even colder than the rest of the basement. I ran my hand along it and realized it wasn't just a crack. It was another door, hidden in the wall. Mark shone his flashlight on it, revealing the rough edges of what looked like a concealed door, blending almost perfectly into the stonework. "What the hell?" he muttered. "How did we miss that?" Kyle stepped forward, shining his light directly on the hidden door. "It's some kind of secret passage," he said, his voice barely containing his surprise. "I've heard of old houses having these, but why would it be down here?" "Who cares why it's here?" Jess said, her voice still trembling. "If it gets us out of this basement, let's open it." Kyle didn't need to be told twice. He ran his hands over the edges of the door, searching for a latch or a handle. After a few tense seconds, he found a small, rusted metal lever hidden in the wall. He pulled on it, and with a groan, the stone door slowly swung open, revealing a dark, narrow passageway beyond. The smell that hit us was worse than anything I had smelled before, damp, rotting, like something had been left to decay for years. But it didn't matter. It was a way out, and that was all we cared about. Kyle shined his flashlight into the passageway. It was just wide enough for us to walk through single file, but the ceiling was low, and the walls were made of rough stone that looked like it could cave in at any moment. "I don't like this," Sarah whispered. "I don't like this at all. Do you want to stay here?" I asked, looking back at her. "Because we don't have a lot of options right now." Reluctantly, Sarah nodded, and we all moved towards the passageway. The air inside was thick and musty, making it hard to breathe. The floor was uneven, and I had to be careful not to trip on the loose stones scattered across it. "Keep moving," Kyle said, leading the way with his flashlight. "There's got to be a way out." As we walked deeper into the passage, the light from the basement behind us started to fade, swallowed by the darkness. My heart was racing, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking into something we didn't understand, something we weren't supposed to find. Then, just when I thought we might have a shot at getting out, I heard it again. The footsteps. The footsteps. This time, they were louder, clearer, and coming from right behind us. I froze in the middle of the passageway, barely able to breathe. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. Kyle stopped too, and slowly turned his head to look back at us, his flashlight shaking in his hand. "Did you guys hear that?" he whispered, like somehow speaking any louder would make whatever it was hear us more clearly. We all nodded, too scared to speak. Jess, who was right behind me, grabbed my arm, her fingers digging in hard enough to hurt. I could feel her trembling, and honestly, I wasn't doing much better. I kept my eyes trained on the darkness behind us, half expecting to see something, someone, step out of the shadows. But there was nothing, just that horrible sound of footsteps, as if something heavy was dragging itself through the basement, creeping towards us. "We need to move," Mark said, his voice barely a whisper. He was standing at the back of the line, closest to the sound. "Like now." Kyle, still in the front, turned and started walking faster, almost jogging through the narrow passage. The rest of us followed, our footsteps hurried and uneven as we stumbled over the rough stone floor. The walls felt like they were closing in on us, and the air was thick, damp, almost choking. Every step felt heavier, like something was weighing us down. I could hear Jess whispering to herself behind me. This isn't happening. This isn't real. We're gonna be fine. We're gonna be fine. She kept repeating it over and over, but her voice was shaky, like she didn't even believe it herself. The passage twisted and turned in ways that didn't make any sense. I kept thinking we were almost out, that any second we'd see light ahead or a door, but it just kept going. The walls were getting narrower, forcing us to hunch over as we walked. It was getting harder to breathe, and the smell of rot and dampness was overpowering. Then the footsteps stopped. We all froze, the sudden silence hitting us like a punch to the gut. For a moment, it was like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. Maybe it's gone, Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. Or maybe it's just waiting for us. Mark shot back, his tone sharp with panic. Shut up, Mark, Kyle snapped. He was trying to stay calm, trying to keep us together, but I could tell he was losing it too. His eyes were darting around, searching the passage for any sign of an exit. I didn't want to stand still, didn't want to give whatever was out there the chance to catch up to us. We can't just stay here, I said, my voice shaking. We have to keep moving. Kyle nodded and started moving again, faster this time, his flashlight bobbing up and down in the narrow space. I followed close behind, trying not to think about the fact that we were basically running blind in a maze we didn't understand. That's when the sound changed. It wasn't just footsteps anymore. It was something else, a dragging sound like something was being pulled across the floor. Something heavy, like a body. My stomach churned as the sound got closer, echoing off the stone walls. I can't take this, Jess whimpered, her voice trembling as she clung to my arm. I can't. Before she could finish, we heard a loud crash from behind us, followed by the unmistakable sound of something metallic hitting the stone floor. We all spun around, flashlights whipping through the darkness, searching for the source of the noise. Mark's flashlight hit the wall and revealed the door we had entered through, the one hidden in the basement. It had slammed shut. Did that door just close on its own? Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. Kyle swallowed hard, his throat audibly dry. It must have been the wind or something, he muttered, but we all knew that wasn't true. There was no wind down here. There was no reason for that door to slam like that. Okay, that's it, we're screwed, Mark said, backing away from the sound, his eyes wide with panic. We need to get out of here, like now. We all started moving again, faster this time, practically jogging down the passageway. The walls were so tight now that we were all hunched over, squeezing through the narrow space, our flashlights barely cutting through the thick darkness. The dragging sound kept getting closer, and every second felt like a countdown to something horrible. Finally, after what felt like hours, we reached the end of the passageway. There was another door. This one wasn't hidden. It was made of heavy, rotting wood with rusted hinges and a big iron handle. It looked ancient, like something you'd see in an old medieval castle. Do you think it leads outside? Sarah asked, her voice filled with desperate hope. Only one way to find out, Kyle said, grabbing the handle and pulling with all his strength. The door groaned as it swung open, the hinges screeching like nails on a chalkboard. Behind it was another room, a small, stone-walled room with no windows and no other doors. It was a dead end. No. Jess muttered, backing up, her hands covering her mouth in disbelief. This can't be it. There has to be another way out. Kyle stepped into the room, shining his flashlight around, his face pale and sweaty. There's nothing here, he said, his voice hollow. It's just empty. I felt the walls closing in on me. My chest tightened, and I couldn't breathe. We were trapped. We were stuck down here, in this maze of stone and darkness, with no way out. And whatever was behind us, whatever was making those footsteps, it was still out there. It was still coming. What the hell are we going to do? Mark asked, his voice shaking. We can't just stay here and wait for that thing to find us. We have to go back, Kyle said, though he sounded like he didn't even believe it himself. There might be another exit, something we missed. We didn't miss anything. Sarah cried. There's no way out, Kyle. We're trapped. Calm down, Kyle snapped, though his voice cracked with fear. We'll figure this out. But just as he said that, we heard it again. The footsteps. They were louder now, faster, and coming straight for us. The footsteps were getting closer, fast, each one heavier, more deliberate, echoing down the narrow stone corridor behind us. We stood there, frozen for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few seconds, staring at each other in wide-eyed terror. "We need to go," Jess screamed, breaking the silence. Her voice snapped me back to reality, and in a second, we all scrambled into motion, running back down the passageway we had just come through. My heart pounded in my chest, and my flashlight beam wobbled crazily as I tried to keep up with Kyle, who was already leading the way. None of us cared anymore if we tripped or fell. It was like pure instinct kicked in, the only thought in my head being run, 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 and get away from whatever was behind us. The dragging sound was closer now, and every step we took seemed to make it angrier. It was coming for us, and we had no idea what it even was. The narrow passage felt even tighter now. My shoulders scraped against the rough stone walls, and I stumbled more than once, but I didn't dare stop. Behind me, I could hear Jess panting heavily, her breathing almost as loud as the sound of our footsteps echoing through the tight corridor. "Faster!" Mark shouted from behind, his voice trembling with panic. "It's right behind us!" I could feel it too, like this oppressive weight pressing against my back, making the hair on my neck stand up. The air was thick with the smell of rot and decay, and it was hard to breathe, every inhale feeling like I was sucking in dirt and dust. Finally, we reached the door at the end of the passage, the same door that had slammed shut behind us earlier. Kyle grabbed the handle and yanked it open, the hinges screeching in protest as the heavy wooden door swung inward. But just as we tried to step through, something slammed into the door from the other side. Hard. The door swung back, hitting Kyle in the shoulder and knocking him off balance. He staggered, barely catching himself before falling. "What the hell was that?" I yelled, grabbing the door and trying to pull it open again. "I don't know," Kyle shouted back, but I could hear the raw panic in his voice. "Just pull." Together, we yanked on the door, forcing it open just enough for us to squeeze through one by one. I pushed Jess forward, and she stumbled through first, followed by Sarah and Mark. I was about to step through when I heard it. A low, guttural growl. Not human, not animal. Something else. Something wrong. My blood turned cold. I didn't dare look back. "Kyle, come on," I shouted, grabbing his arm and pulling him through the door just as it slammed shut behind us again. This time, we didn't bother trying to figure out what had caused it. We just ran. We stumbled back into the basement, flashlights swinging wildly in every direction as we tried to find our way. The air was still cold, and that horrible, musty smell of decay was even stronger than before. My head was spinning, my legs aching from running, but I couldn't stop. "Not yet. Where do we go now?" Sarah cried, clutching her flashlight tightly, her eyes wide with fear. "We need to find another way out," Kyle said, his voice ragged as he scanned the basement. "There's got to be another door or a window. Asterisk something. Asterisk." We moved quickly, frantically searching the room for anything that could get us out of this nightmare. I ran over to the far side of the basement, where I had noticed earlier there were some old wooden crates stacked against the wall. I started yanking them away, my hands trembling as I tossed the heavy crates aside. Behind them, I found what I had been hoping for. A small window, barely big enough for a person to crawl through, but it was there. "Guys, over here!" I shouted, waving them over. They ran to me, their faces full of hope and desperation. Mark shined his flashlight on the window, but when we got closer, we realized the problem. It was covered in thick iron bars, rusted but still strong. "Damn it," Kyle cursed, kicking at the bars with all his strength. "We're trapped." No, we're not," I said, even though I wasn't so sure myself. "We just have to—" Bang! The sound came from the basement door, the one that led to the hallway we had just escaped from. Something, whatever had been following us, had slammed into it, hard enough to make the door rattle in its frame. Jess let out a sob, her body shaking. "We're not going to make it," she whispered. "It's going to get us." "No, it's not," Kyle snapped, his voice sharp and commanding, though I could tell he was just as scared as the rest of us. "We'll find a way out. We have to." Just then, the door creaked. Slowly, it began to open, None of us could move. It felt like time had stopped, like we were frozen in place, staring at the door as it swung open inch by inch. A figure stepped through. At first, I thought it was a shadow, the way it seemed to blend into the darkness of the basement. But then it moved, and I saw it clearly. A tall, gaunt figure, its skin pale and stretched tight over its bones, wearing what looked like old, tattered clothes covered in dirt and grime. Its eyes, sunken hollow, locked onto us, and its mouth twisted into a sick, twisted grin. We all screamed. Kyle grabbed the nearest object he could find, an old metal pipe, and swung it at the figure. It barely flinched, its eyes fixed on us, as if Kyle's attack was nothing more than an inconvenience. "Get back!" Kyle shouted, swinging the pipe again, this time harder. But it was no use. The figure just kept coming slowly, deliberately, like it knew we had nowhere to go. "Run!" I shouted, pulling Jess towards the basement stairs. "We have to get upstairs now." We bolted up the stairs, our feet pounding on the old wooden steps, and burst into the main part of the house. The air felt different up here, warmer, less oppressive, but the sense of danger was still thick, clinging to us like a second skin. "We need to get out of the house," Sarah screamed, tears streaming down her face. "We need to." Suddenly, the front door burst open. For a split second, I thought maybe we were saved, that someone had heard our screams and come to help. But when I looked, my heart sank. Standing in the doorway was Kyle. But Kyle was with us. I turned to look at the Kyle standing next to me, and my blood ran cold. The Kyle beside me wasn't moving. He was staring at the figure in the doorway, his eyes wide with shock. The figure, the real Kyle smiled at us. "You're not supposed to be here," he said, his voice low and menacing. It was a Friday night when Kyle invited us over to check out his new place. He just moved into this old, creepy house on the outskirts of town. I remember when he first showed us pictures of it in our group chat. I wasn't exactly thrilled. The place looked like it belonged in some horror movie. Broken shutters, peeling paint, and tall, twisted trees looming over it like they were trying to hide it from the world. But Kyle was stoked. He called it charming or vintage. You know, the kind of stuff people say to make something terrible sound cool. I wasn't buying it. Still, a night of beers with my friends sounded better than sitting at home alone, so I said I'd be there. When I pulled up to the house, I wasn't prepared for how unsettling it actually looked in person. The place was massive, but not in a fancy way. More like the kind of place where you wouldn't be surprised to see a for sale sign in the front yard for 20 years, with no one daring to buy it. The porch creaked under my feet as I walked up, and I remember thinking, this house is alive. I knocked, but no one answered, so I just let myself in. The door wasn't locked, and as soon as I stepped inside, I was hit by the smell. Old wood, dust, and something else I couldn't place, maybe mold or damp. It wasn't pleasant, whatever it was. "Kyle," I called out, my voice echoing through the hallway. "Back here, man." I heard him shout from deeper inside the house. His voice seemed far away, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was swallowing the sound. I walked into the living room, where the rest of the group was already hanging out. Mark, Sarah, and Jess. They were lounging around on this old, beat-up couch Kyle must have gotten from a thrift store, beers in hand, acting like everything was totally normal. "You made it," Kyle grinned at me, handing me a cold beer as soon as I walked in. He seemed relaxed, like the place wasn't creepy at all. "What do you think of the new place?" I looked around. The room was dimly lit, even though there were a couple of lamps scattered around. The walls were lined with old, dusty shelves filled with random knickknacks left behind by whoever lived here before. There was this huge painting of some stern-looking guy on the wall, staring down at us like we didn't belong. "Dude, this place is something," I said, trying not to sound too freaked out. "Did you check for ghosts before you signed the lease?" Kyle laughed, but there was something about it that felt off, like maybe he didn't find the joke as funny as he was pretending to. "Come on, it's just an old house," he said, taking a sip of his beer. "Nothing wrong with a little character, right?" I shrugged, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. It didn't help that every time the wind blew, the windows rattled, making this weird, high-pitched whine like the house itself was breathing. I sat down with the rest of the group, trying to ignore the weird vibes and focus on having a good time. "So, Kyle," Sarah said, leaning forward, Have you checked out the whole place yet? I mean, it's huge. There's got to be some weird stuff hiding around here. Yeah, Mark chimed in, clearly getting into the spooky mood. Like, what's up with the basement? Every old house has a creepy basement. Kyle hesitated for a second, just long enough for me to notice. Then he grinned again, but it didn't quite reach his eyes this time. The basement's, well, it's definitely creepy, he said, laughing a little too loudly. I haven't gone down there much. The lights don't work, and I think the previous owners just used it for storage or something. It's full of old junk. That's exactly why we should check it out, Jess said with a mischievous smile. Come on, Kyle. You can't move into a creepy old house and not explore the basement. It's like against the rules. I didn't like the sound of this. I had a bad feeling about going down there, but of course I wasn't about to be the only one to chicken out. Kyle looked around at all of us, and I could tell he wasn't too thrilled with the idea either. But, like me, he didn't want to back down. All right, he said, standing up. But if we all die down there, it's on you, Jess. She laughed, but there was a nervous edge to it. None of us were as confident as we were pretending to be. Kyle grabbed a couple of flashlights from a drawer in the kitchen, because apparently the basement lights had been out since he moved in, and we made our way towards the basement door. As soon as we got close to it, the air felt colder, and the smell, God, it was awful. Like damp earth mixed with something rotten. Kyle opened the door, and it made this long, eerie creak that seemed to go on forever. Well, here goes nothing, Kyle said, trying to sound casual, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. We all exchanged glances, then started down the stairs into the darkness, not realizing that this was just the beginning. For a moment, none of us could move. We just stood there, staring at the two Kyles, the one standing next to me, trembling with fear, and the other one in the doorway, his smile twisted into something I barely recognized. My mind couldn't process it. How is this possible? How could there be two of him? Kyle, Jess whispered, her voice shaky as she clung to my arm, her eyes darting between the two figures. What's happening? The Kyle next to me, Kyle, stared at the figure in the doorway, his face pale and drained of all color. Who the hell are you? He finally managed to choke out, his voice filled with confusion and terror. The other Kyle, the one in the doorway, let out a low chuckle that sent a shiver down my spine. I'm exactly who you think I am, he said, his voice a perfect match for Kyle's, but with something darker, something wrong lurking underneath. You just don't remember, do you? Remember what? Sarah asked, her voice breaking as tears streamed down her face. What the hell is going on here? The figure in the doorway stepped forward, his grin widening. This house, it needs someone. It's always needed someone. And Kyle here, he gestured to the one standing next to me. He was supposed to be the one. But then you all showed up, didn't you? You ruined everything. I looked at our Kyle, and the look on his face was one I'll never forget. Pure, unfiltered terror, like he was slowly realizing something horrifying. What are you talking about? He stammered, backing away from the figure in the doorway. I don't know what you mean. Oh, but you do, the other Kyle said, his smile never wavering. You've always known. You just didn't want to remember. My head was spinning. None of this made any sense. What was he talking about? Why was this happening? I turned to Kyle, the Kyle we'd come with, the one we'd been friends with for years. Kyle, what is he saying? What does he mean? Kyle looked at me, his eyes wide and full of panic. I don't know, he shouted, but I could see the cracks in his denial, the way his hands were shaking. He wasn't just scared, he was remembering. I've been here before, he whispered, almost to himself. His eyes darted around the room, taking in the peeling wallpaper, the cracked floorboards, the way the shadows seemed to crawl along the walls. This house, it's familiar. I've been here. No, Mark said, stepping forward, his face twisted with confusion. Kyle, we all came here for the first time tonight. What are you talking about? But Kyle wasn't listening. He was staring at the figure in the doorway, who was still smiling that twisted, mocking smile. You're not real, Kyle said, his voice shaking. You're not me. Oh, I'm as real as you are, the other Kyle said, stepping even closer. I'm the part of you that you forgot. The part of you that belongs to this house. What the hell does that even mean? I demanded, my heart pounding in my chest as I stepped in front of Jess and Sarah, trying to shield them from the nightmare unfolding in front of us. The figure, The other Kyle tilted his head slightly, as if considering my question. It's simple, he said, his tone almost casual. This house, it needs to keep someone. That's how it survives. And Kyle here? He was chosen a long time ago. Kyle, Kyle, shook his head violently. No, that's not true. I just moved in. You didn't just move in. The other Kyle interrupted, his voice sharp now, cutting through the air like a knife. You've always been here. You just don't remember. The house, it took that from you. I felt a chill run down my spine. What he was saying, it didn't make any sense. But at the same time, there was something in Kyle's eyes, a flicker of recognition, of realization. He looked like someone who was waking up from a dream, or maybe falling into one. I don't understand, Kyle whispered, his voice breaking. What did the house do to me? It keeps you, the other Kyle said, his voice soft again, almost comforting. You were supposed to be alone. The house needs someone to stay, someone to keep it alive. But you brought them, your friends, and now it's hungry. It needs more. Sarah let out a sob, and Jess was shaking beside me, clinging to my arm like she was afraid to let go. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to stop this. We need to leave, I whispered to the others, trying to keep my voice steady. We need to get out of here. But the other Kyle shook his head slowly. You can't leave, he said, his smile fading. Not now. Not anymore. Like hell we can't, Mark growled, stepping forward, fists clenched. We're leaving, and you're not stopping us. The other Kyle just stared at him, that eerie calm settling over him again. Go ahead, he said, his voice cold. Try. Kyle, Kyle, took a step forward, looking at his other self with a mixture of fear and defiance. If I leave, you don't exist, he said, his voice trembling but stronger now. You're just a part of this house. You don't control me. The other Kyle's smile returned, slow and twisted. Maybe, but if you leave, they don't. For a second, no one moved. The weight of his words hit us all at once like a punch to the gut. What do you mean? Jess whispered, her voice barely audible. The other Kyle looked at us, his eyes dark and empty. If you leave, the house will take them. You might survive, but they won't. You're tied to this place, Kyle, and now so are they. I felt my stomach drop. I looked at Kyle, at the real Kyle, and saw the horror in his eyes as the truth sank in. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about all of us. Kyle shook his head, his voice breaking. I can't let that happen. You don't have a choice, the other Kyle said, stepping even closer. One of you has to stay. That's the rule. The room was silent, except for the sound of our breathing, ragged and uneven. I could feel my heart racing, panic rising in my chest as I looked at Kyle, hoping, praying he would find some way out of this. Kyle looked at me, his eyes filled with pain. I'm sorry, he whispered. And then, before any of us could stop him, he stepped forward toward the other Kyle, toward the darkness, and whispered, Take me. The other Kyle smiled, and just like that, the room went dark. The footsteps stopped. The dragging sound ceased. The cold, oppressive air lifted, and for the first time since we had entered the house, it felt quiet, peaceful almost. When the lights flickered back on, Kyle was gone, and so was the other one. We stood there in stunned silence, unable to process what had just happened. My hands were shaking, and I felt Jess grip my arm tighter, her breath coming in short gasps. Kyle, Sarah whispered, her voice thick with tears. He's gone. We all looked around, hoping, praying that somehow he'd come back, that he hadn't just sacrificed himself for us. But the house was silent, and we knew the truth. Kyle had kept the house alive, but at the cost of his own life. We didn't speak as we left. We couldn't. The house let us go, but we knew it was still hungry, and it would wait. It always waits,